Constraints, as the name suggests, are used to constrain or fully define our sketches. And this will be a very important concept in creating and finishing off our sketches and designs. Now, in many cases, we may want auto constraint there turned on, as this will help automatically throw in constraints. But for this lesson, I'm going to just turn that off, just so we can also learn how to throw in our constraints manually. So notice we have a whole number of constraints here, and we're going to learn about each of these throughout the next few lessons. So first, I'll just start with this simple line, and I can tap to select the line. And currently this line is completely unconstrained. It has no constraints on it. And we can see that if I can move around this line completely freely, I can tap to select one of the endpoints, move either of these around freely as well. So I can really move this in any direction, and we can see that it's pretty much completely unconstrained currently. So now let's take a look at adding some constraints to this line. Let's first look at the lock constraint down at the bottom there, and I'll just tap to turn on the lock constraint. And right away you may have noticed that the two endpoints of this line have now turned a darker color. Previously they were that lighter white color. And this is just indicating to me that now this line is locked into place. Meaning that now if I were to tap to select my line and try to move this around, notice it's not moving at all as we've locked it into place. And of course, just in the same way, down at the bottom now I have unlock, so I can tap to unlock. Notice that, again, my two endpoints have turned the lighter white color instead of the darker color to indicate these points are no longer locked. And now, tap to select, and once again I can freely move this object. So I can see I can lock entire lines or entire objects. I can also lock individual points as well if I would like. So let's tap to select the bottom endpoint here, and again tap lock. Notice now that only my bottom endpoint is that darker color indicating it's locked, where my upper endpoint is the lighter white color indicating it's not locked. So as we might expect, if I tap to select this bottom endpoint, notice I cannot move this around at all as it is locked in, whereas if I tap to select my upper endpoint here, I can still freely move this unlocked point. Also notice when selecting endpoints, of course I could use the lock button on my right hand side here, but also notice I have a lock icon coming right below the actual point itself. So this just gives me another even faster method of locking in these points. So I can just tap to select this lock icon. Notice it's now coming in locked, and we can see that is locked in as well. And in just the same way, we can unlock with that icon as well. And maybe I'll tap and unlock this bottom endpoint also. Another constraint I use very, very frequently is the horizontal or vertical constraint. So here again, tap to select any line, and now notice I have the horizontal vertical constraint available. And as expected, if I just tap to select this horizontal vertical constraint, notice now my line is coming in vertically, and I also have this icon here indicating that I have a vertical constraint. And of course what this means is this line is now vertical, and no matter how I try to change this, move this around, move an endpoint around, notice it's keeping my line vertical as it has that vertical constraint. If I ever want to get rid of or delete a constraint, I can just tap to select the constraint itself and tap this X to delete or get rid of that vertical constraint in this case. Now I should be able to change the angle of my line such that it's no longer vertical. And as expected, horizontal constraints work in just the same way. And how the horizontal vertical constraint works is if your line is closer to being vertical, it will create the vertical constraint, or if your line is closer to being the horizontal, it will create the horizontal constraint. So now if I use horizontal vertical, since this particular line is fairly close to being horizontal, we will see that this throws in the horizontal constraint now. And in just the same way, I can try to move this around any way, and notice it's locked in to being constrained as a horizontal line here. And of course, the exact same idea, if I wanted to get rid of that horizontal, I can tap on the constraint, tap the X. Notice that this is no longer constrained to be a horizontal line.